My family rejected me when I was down, but their plea for help was my sweetest revenge. The antique mahogany table, meticulously polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the flickering candlelight, casting long, dancing shadows across two faces etched with desperate anxiety. Serafina, typically a vision of effortless composure, her features a mask of carefully applied perfection and designer elegance, was now a portrait of utter disarray. Her eyes, usually sparkling with ambition, were red-rimmed and swollen, her expensive suit rumpled and askew. Beside her, Elara, the matriarch who had once ruled their world with an iron fist wrapped in silk, appeared to have aged a decade overnight. Her usual imperious posture, a regal bearing that demanded reverence, was gone, replaced by a defeated slump that seemed to shrink her formidable presence. Their pleas, once delivered with a haughty demand that expected immediate compliance, had dwindled to a near whisper, a pitiful, broken plea that barely carried across the polished surface of the table. They spoke of the impending collapse of their legacy, the final, crushing blow that threatened to erase centuries of their carefully constructed prestige, a lineage they had cultivated with meticulous, often ruthless, precision. They spoke of ruin, of public humiliation, of a life they could no longer imagine without the shimmering facade of immense wealth and unyielding influence. They spoke, quite simply, of begging for salvation from a fate they believed was beyond their control. He simply listened, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, his gaze steady, unwavering, meeting theirs without a flicker of emotion. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips, a secret warmth that had nothing to do with their profound suffering. It was a warmth born of quiet satisfaction, of a symmetry so perfect it bordered on art. They continued to speak, their voices thick with the desperation that clawed at their throats, their words painting a vivid, agonizing picture of the abyss they now faced. They believed this, truly believed, that this was their lowest point, the ultimate nadir of their existence. They had no idea, not the slightest inkling, that their grand and dramatic performance was merely the prologue to a much larger, far more intricate play. The irony, bitter and exquisitely sharp, was not lost on him. They were pleading for his help, the very person they had cast aside, disowned, and publicly shamed with such casual cruelty. And the true beauty of it was, they didn't even know why they were truly here, beyond their immediate, pressing crisis. They had no idea of the quiet storm he had been brewing, not for a few fleeting years, but for over a decade, with meticulous precision and unwavering resolve. The air in the room was thick with their despair, a tangible weight of their impending doom, but for him, it was simply the calm before a very specific, long-anticipated dawn. To truly understand the weight of that moment, the silent victory that hummed in his veins, one must first understand the journey that had led him to that table, to that very seat of quiet power. His story, like many, began not with an inheritance or a birthright, but with a dream, an ambition that burned brighter than any inherited wealth or societal expectation. He was the younger son, the outlier in a family defined by tradition and rigidity, the one who saw the world not as a fixed structure of inherited privilege, but as an ever-evolving canvas of innovation and boundless possibility. While Serafina was perfecting her debutante curtsy, meticulously learning the intricate dance of high society, and Elara was orchestrating grand galas, meticulously maintaining their public image, he was immersed in the nascent world of technology. He would spend countless nights coding, the glow of the screen illuminating his determined face, dreaming of algorithms and groundbreaking applications that could genuinely change lives, not just accumulate more wealth. His family, the Montagues, had always been defined by their legacy, a heavy mantle of expectation and an unyielding commitment to their name. For over a century, the Montague Group had stood as a titan in traditional finance and real estate, a sprawling empire built on conservative investments and old money connections that often felt more like gilded cages. His mother, Elara, embodied this legacy in every fiber of her being. She was a woman of formidable presence, her sharp intellect always directed towards upholding the family name, maintaining pristine appearances, and securing advantageous alliances that further cemented their power. Sentimentality was viewed as a debilitating weakness, true familial bonds secondary to the grand, unshakable narrative of the Montague dynasty. Serafina, his elder sister, was her perfect protégée. Beautiful, charming, and utterly devoid of genuine depth, she was the quintessential socialite, a master of navigating the intricate dance of high society, her every move calculated to enhance her own standing and, by extension, the family's. Their world was one of polished veneers, where reputation was the highest currency, and any hint of weakness was anathema, to be ruthlessly suppressed. His divergence from this meticulously prescribed path was met with polite, then increasingly overt, disapproval. When he chose to study computer science instead of corporate finance, the family's preferred and expected field, it was dismissed as a curious disappointment, a youthful folly. When he spoke with fervent passion of startups and disruptive technologies rather than mergers and acquisitions, the very lifeblood of their empire, it was considered a peculiar eccentricity, a charming but ultimately irrelevant deviation. But when he poured his modest inheritance, a small sum left to him by a distant, rebellious aunt who had once encouraged his independent spirit, into his own tech venture in his early 20s, it was seen as an outright affront, a direct challenge to their established order. "Rhysand, darling," Alara had once purred, her voice dripping with condescension, a chilling sweetness that masked her disdain. "Why build something from nothing when you can simply inherit everything, ready-made and perfectly polished?" Serafina, ever pragmatic in her superficiality, added, with a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand, "It's so much work, Rhysand." "And for what? To sit in front of a screen all day, when you could be enjoying the fruits of 100 years of labor?" The subtle jabs, the condescending smiles, they all chipped away at his spirit, yet simultaneously hardened his resolve. His startup, Nexus Innovations, was his passion, his everything, a sanctuary from the gilded superficiality of his family's world. It was an ambitious platform designed to democratize access to cutting-edge AI tools, a vision he believed could truly empower individuals and small businesses, creating a world where innovation was not confined to the privileged few. For 2 exhilarating years, he lived and breathed Nexus. He worked 16-hour days, subsisted on instant noodles and lukewarm coffee, and poured every ounce of his being into its development. He believed in its potential with an unshakable conviction, and more importantly, he believed in himself, a belief his family had systematically tried to dismantle. He had assembled a small team of equally passionate individuals, brilliant minds who shared his vision, and together, they were on the cusp of a breakthrough. They had secured preliminary interest from several prominent venture capitalists, developed a robust prototype that generated undeniable excitement, and were generating significant buzz within the burgeoning tech community. He remembered the feeling of exhilaration, the taste of impending success. Then, the market shifted, a sudden, brutal tremor that sent shockwaves through the fragile startup ecosystem. A larger, far more established tech giant, with seemingly limitless resources and an army of legal and marketing experts, launched a competing product. This product, eerily similar in its core functionality, was backed by a marketing budget Nexus Innovations could only dream of. The shift was immediate and devastating. Their funding dried up overnight. The investors, once so eager and effusive in their praise, evaporated into the ether, their promises dissolving like mist. Nexus Innovations, his dream, his sacrifice, his future, imploded with spectacular public finality. It wasn't a slow decline, it was a swift, brutal execution. The headlines were merciless, painting him as a naive dreamer, a cautionary tale for any aspiring entrepreneur who dared to challenge the established order. His name, Rhysand Montague, became synonymous with spectacular failure in the unforgiving tech world, a scarlet letter branded upon his very identity. The family's reaction was swift and merciless, devoid of any hint of empathy or concern for his well-being. It wasn't just the financial loss they deplored, it was the public humiliation, the undeniable stain on their pristine reputation, a blemish they found utterly intolerable. Alara summoned him to her study, a cavernous room usually reserved for stern business discussions and the signing of grand, lucrative contracts, never for familial comfort. She sat behind her enormous oak desk, its surface gleaming under the subdued lighting, an imposing figure of unyielding authority. Serafina perched elegantly on a nearby fauteuil, observing him with a detached, almost scientific curiosity, as if he were an interesting specimen of a failed experiment. "Rhysand," Alara began, her voice devoid of warmth, as cold and sharp as the winter air. This setback is unacceptable. It reflects poorly on us. On the Montague name. He tried to explain, to articulate the invaluable lessons learned from his failure, the profound resilience forged in the crucible of adversity. He even dared to ask for a small loan, a mere fraction of what they spent on a single charity gala, just enough to pivot, to try again with a revised strategy, armed with hard-won experience. He was not asking for charity, but for a belief in his capacity to learn and adapt, a chance to prove his worth. Their response was chilling, delivered with an almost surgical precision. "Absolutely not," Alara declared, her eyes like chips of ice, reflecting no warmth, no compassion. "We do not invest in failures. Nor do we associate with them. Your venture has become a public embarrassment, a blot on our ledger. It is time you understood the consequences of your choices, Rhysand." Serafina, ever the voice of cold reason in their eyes, added, with a dismissive flick of her wrist, "You chose this path, Rhysand. You chose to be different, to reject everything we offered you. Now you must live with the consequences. Don't expect us to clean up your mess. It would simply encourage further recklessness, further deviations from your place." They then delivered the ultimate blow, not with shouts or tears, but with a quiet, devastating finality that cut deeper than any physical wound. Effective immediately, Alara stated, her voice flat, devoid of any discernible emotion, "You are no longer to use the Montague name in any professional capacity. You are disowned, Rhysand. You have made your bed, now lie in it. Do not contact us again unless you have something substantial to offer the family." The words echoed in the cavernous room, striking deeper than any physical blow could have. Disowned. Not just from their vast wealth, but from their very identity, from the name that defined them. It was a clear, unambiguous statement. He was no longer one of them, erased from their carefully constructed narrative. The betrayal was complete, the abandonment absolute. He walked out of that opulent mansion, not with tears, for his spirit was too numb for such an outward display of pain, but with a cold, clear resolve that settled deep within his bones. The sting of their words, the crushing weight of their contempt, didn't break him. Instead, it forged him anew. It ignited a fire, a quiet, controlled burn that would fuel his every subsequent action, every strategic decision, every painstaking hour of work. In the profound solitude that followed, amidst the silent debris of his spectacularly failed startup, he found his secret weapon. It wasn't a hidden technology or a forgotten fortune. It was the profound clarity that came with absolute rejection, a liberation from the crushing weight of their expectations. They had valued status over genuine familial connection, reputation over actual worth. And in doing so, they had unwittingly shown him their greatest vulnerability, their profound superficiality and their unwavering, arrogant belief in the unassailable power of their name, a power they assumed would last forever. His secret weapon was a multifaceted approach, born from the crucible of that searing betrayal. Firstly, it was his intellect, sharpened to an almost predatory edge by failure and necessity. He didn't just understand technology, he began to understand the intricate dance of global markets, the subtle currents of high finance, the often overlooked vulnerabilities of seemingly impregnable corporate empires. He plunged into the study of corporate law, not to become a lawyer, but to understand the complex legal frameworks that underpinned grand businesses and their myriad potential pitfalls. He devoured books on financial engineering, economic cycles, and even corporate espionage, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. He learned to see the world not just through lines of elegant code, but through meticulously crafted spreadsheets, complex algorithms, and dense legal clauses. Secondly, it was his resilience, tempered by their chilling cruelty. They had believed they had crushed him, reduced him to nothing more than a cautionary tale. Instead, they had liberated him from the burdensome weight of their expectations, from the soul-crushing need to conform to their rigid standards. He was free to build something truly his own, something that didn't rely on inherited privilege or a superficial, inherited name. His ambition wasn't to get back at them in a childish fit of rage. It was far more profound. It was to build an empire so formidable, so undeniably successful, so utterly dominant, that their very existence would eventually become a mere footnote in its colossal shadow. He wanted them to see what they had so casually discarded, not through boasts or confrontational words, but through the sheer, undeniable weight of his accomplishments, a silent, irrefutable testament to his worth. Thirdly, and perhaps most crucially, his secret weapon was information, meticulously gathered and strategically deployed. He recognized that their power, while outwardly impressive and seemingly unassailable, was built on a foundation of deep-seated complacency and a profound aversion to true innovation. They were irrevocably stuck in the past, relying on outdated business models and a network of equally stagnant, complacent associates who mirrored their own flaws. He began to meticulously observe the Montague group, not with malicious intent, but with a detached, analytical gaze, like a scientist studying a dying organism. He followed their public filings, read between the lines of their carefully worded press releases, and observed the crucial market trends that they, in their hubris, consistently ignored. He saw the cracks forming long before they did, the over-leveraged assets, the risky, ill-advised investments in dying industries, the growing legal vulnerabilities due to their aggressive, often ethically questionable, business practices. He understood their weaknesses better than they understood themselves, having dismantled and analyzed their structure piece by painstaking piece. This wasn't about wishing them ill, it was about recognizing an inevitable trajectory for an enterprise that adamantly refused to adapt to a changing world. And finally, his secret weapon was patience, an almost superhuman capacity for it. He knew that true revenge, the kind that resonates with a deep, satisfying hum in one's very being, is not swift but slow, meticulously orchestrated. It is a carefully composed symphony, not a sudden, jarring cacophony. He would build his empire in the shadows, quietly, deliberately, brick by painstaking brick, until the time was undeniably ripe for their eventual reckoning. He would become the very thing they disdained, a self-made titan, and then, and only then, would the true game begin, a game where the rules were set by him. His past had been defined by their cruel rejection, his future would be defined by his absolute, unshakable independence from them. In the years that followed, his meticulously crafted plan began to unfold, quietly, precisely, with the relentless precision of a finely tuned machine. He disappeared from their world, an erased chapter in their family history, a forgotten anomaly. They believed he had vanished into obscurity, just another casualty of the cutthroat tech industry, a fleeting failure. They rarely spoke of him, and when they did, it was usually with a dismissive wave of the hand, a brief, cautionary tale of the importance of knowing your place and not daring to stray from the inherited path. This suited him perfectly. Their contempt was his cloak of invisibility, his most effective disguise. The less they thought of him, the less they considered him a threat, the more freedom he had to operate. He started small, with nothing but his exceptional coding skills, a fierce intellect honed by adversity, and an almost pathological work ethic that drove him through sleepless nights. His first venture, Ether Labs, was a quiet success, a boutique software development firm that specialized in secure data encryption, a niche but highly critical area. It wasn't flashy, didn't generate sensational headlines, but it was profoundly profitable and, more importantly, it allowed him to build substantial capital and a network of trusted individuals who valued merit, talent, and vision over lineage or inherited status. He reinvested every penny, not in lavish expenditures or displays of wealth, but in acquiring deeper knowledge and attracting the best talent. He sought out the brightest minds, the quiet innovators, the individuals who, like him, were often overlooked or dismissed by the mainstream, by the old guard. Together, they built their empire brick by brick, foundation by foundation, not in the physical realm of grand estates and tangible assets, but in the intricate, powerful digital realm. As Ether Labs quietly grew, expanding its reach and influence, he diversified his investments. He founded Quantum Nexus, a venture capital firm with a specific, laser focus on disruptive technologies, particularly those that held the potential to reshape traditional industries much like the Montague Group's. He didn't just invest capital, he actively mentored, guided, and sometimes even acquired promising startups, nurturing them with a careful hand. His name, Rhysand, became synonymous with visionary foresight and unparalleled success in the tech world, whispered with respect and a touch of awe. He operated with a quiet confidence, his decisions precise, his strategies always several steps ahead of the competition. He became known as the ghost billionaire, rarely seen, rarely interviewed, but always leaving an indelible mark on the global tech landscape, an invisible force shaping the future. His success was a resounding testament to the fact that true power resided not in inherited privilege or a prestigious name, but in intellect, relentless innovation, and unwavering determination. While his empire quietly expanded, steadily consolidating its power, he continued his detached observation of the Montague group, a silent, omnipresent specter. Their arrogance, as he had predicted with chilling accuracy, only grew with their continued, albeit increasingly fragile, success. Serafina flaunted her latest acquisitions on social media, her life a curated montage of designer clothes, exotic vacations in exclusive resorts, and exclusive parties, all meticulously documented for public consumption. Elara continued to host her elaborate charity galas, meticulously maintaining the illusion of unassailable prestige and boundless influence, even as the first whispers of deep financial instability began to circulate in the less polite, more informed circles of their world. He saw the cracks deepening, widening with each passing year. Their traditional business model, built on slow, steady growth in conservative markets, was becoming obsolete, a relic in a rapidly accelerating world. They were stubbornly resistant to digital transformation, viewing technology as a passing fad rather than an existential imperative, a crucial tool for survival. Their leadership, entrenched and complacent, made a series of disastrous investments in failing industries, doubling down on outdated ventures rather than embracing the future. The lawsuit that now threatened them, the one Serafina and Elara now spoke of with such terror, was one he had actually predicted years ago in his meticulous analyses. It stemmed from an old, aggressive acquisition deal that had always been legally dubious, a risky shortcut they had taken, believing their immense influence and powerful connections would shield them from any repercussions. He had noted it in his detailed analysis of their vulnerabilities, a ticking time bomb he knew would eventually detonate, a reckoning for their past hubris. They were slowly, imperceptibly, suffocating themselves with their own outdated methods and refusal to adapt. And he, from his carefully constructed vantage point, watched with a calm, almost academic interest, devoid of personal animosity. He never interfered directly, never pulled a hidden lever to hasten their decline, for that would have been too easy, too direct, too messy. Their downfall was entirely self-inflicted, a natural and inevitable consequence of their profound hubris and their stubborn refusal to adapt to a changing world. His silence, which they interpreted as continued insignificance or even weakness, was in fact the quiet hum of a perfectly executed strategy, the unseen gears of a grand design turning. They assumed he was still the disowned failure, the artistic dreamer who had stumbled and vanished into obscurity. They had no idea he was the architect of his own destiny, and by extension, an unwitting observer of theirs, meticulously documenting their self-destruction. Every time they dismissed him, every time they spoke of their unshakable legacy, they were unknowingly fueling the very circumstances that would lead them, inevitably, to his door. They were simply unaware that the quiet, self-made man they so arrogantly ignored was the only person who truly understood the intricate workings of their impending collapse, the only one who had seen the whole picture. The trap wasn't set by him, it was set by their own profound arrogance, their short-sightedness, and their unyielding belief in their own invincibility. He simply waited for them to step into it, for the inevitable conclusion of their own choices. The summons came not as a dignified email or a formal letter, but as a series of increasingly frantic phone calls, each more desperate than the last, and then, finally, a truly desperate personal visit from one of their most trusted, and equally terrified, legal advisors. He was a man who had once treated him with dismissive disdain, now reduced to stammering pleas, his polished facade crumbling under the weight of their crisis. The Montague group was on the absolute brink. The catastrophic financial crisis they faced was not just a mere liquidity problem, it was a systemic failure, a complete collapse of their foundational structures, exacerbated by the impending lawsuit, which threatened to wipe out their remaining assets and expose decades of questionable practices to the unforgiving public eye. They were facing immediate insolvency, complete public disgrace, and the irreversible, complete dismantling of their entire family legacy. They needed a miracle, an intervention of unimaginable scale, and somehow, through their increasingly desperate searches for a solution, his name had emerged. Not as the disowned son, the forgotten failure, but as Rhysand, the reclusive tech titan, whose innovative solutions and unparalleled foresight were now the only beacon of hope in a world rapidly abandoning traditional finance and old-world thinking. The meeting was set in his private office, a minimalist space of glass and steel, starkly modern, high above the bustling city, commanding an almost unsettling view of the urban sprawl. It was a deliberate contrast to the ornate, gilded cages of their world, designed to subtly convey a new kind of power. They arrived punctually, their faces etched with a potent mixture of raw fear and barely concealed resentment, a fragile mask of dignity. Serafina and Alara, accompanied by their most senior legal counsel and their chief financial officer, looked utterly out of place, like exotic, brightly plumed birds trapped in a utilitarian cage, their customary splendor diminished. Rhysand, Alara began, her voice hoarse, a mere shadow of its former imperiousness, its commanding tone replaced by a desperate tremor. We need your help. The situation is dire. The Montague group is facing unprecedented challenges, the likes of which we have never seen. Serafina, ever the one to cut to the chase, though her usual venom was replaced by a desperate tremor, added, her voice thin with anxiety, we need a bailout, Rhysand. A substantial investment. And a strategy to navigate this legal quagmire. You're the only one with the resources, the foresight to pull us out of this. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, a cool, detached observer. Foresight? He echoed, his voice calm, almost conversational, the word hanging in the air with a subtle weight. Interesting choice of word. He gestured to the empty, modern chairs opposite his desk, their design sleek and unadorned. Please, sit. Let's discuss the details, shall we? They settled, their eyes darting around the room, taking in the understated luxury, the tangible proof of his immense success, a success so unlike their own. The chief financial officer, a man usually brimming with confident figures, launched into a detailed, increasingly panicked account of their financial woes. He spoke of insurmountable debt, collapsing revenue streams that once seemed endless, and a plummeting stock value that threatened to obliterate their market standing. The legal counsel then took over, his voice grim as he outlined the intricate complexities of the lawsuit, a multi-billion-dollar class action that threatened to unravel the entire corporation, exposing its deepest secrets. They spoke for nearly an hour, their voices rising and falling with the relentless tide of their despair, painting a devastating picture of a once mighty empire on the very verge of total, irreversible collapse. When they finished, the silence in the room was heavy, almost suffocating, punctuated only by their ragged, desperate breathing. They looked at him, their faces a mixture of expectation and dread, their fate now resting solely in his hands. This was it. The moment they had come for, the culmination of a decade of meticulous planning. He steepled his fingers, his gaze sweeping over their anxious, pallid faces. He understood their predicament, he began, his voice clear and measured, resonating with quiet authority. And he had, in fact, been aware of its development for quite some time, watching it unfold with keen interest. Their eyes widened. Alara frowned, a flicker of her old imperiousness returning. Aware? What did he mean, aware? He meant, he continued, unhurried, letting each word land with precise impact, that the issues they faced today were not sudden, unexpected blows. They were the culmination of years of systemic flaws, of a profound failure to adapt to a changing world, of an over-reliance on outdated practices and, frankly, of a distinct lack of foresight within their leadership. He paused, letting his words sink in, watching their reactions with clinical precision. Their financial models were unsustainable. Their investments were ill-advised, bordering on reckless. And the legal liabilities, particularly the one they were currently facing, were glaringly obvious to anyone who bothered to look beneath their polished, deceptive surface. Serafina scoffed, a flicker of her old arrogance, a last gasp of defiance, returning to her features. Rhysand, he didn't understand the complexities of traditional finance. This was entirely different from his apps and coding. He met her gaze, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. On the contrary, Serafina. He understood it intimately. In fact, he understood it better than they did. He then pressed a button on his desk, and a holographic display shimmered to life in the center of the table, casting an ethereal glow. It was a complex, multi-layered financial projection, intricately detailed. This, he said, gesturing to the glowing data, was a real-time analysis of the Montague Group's financial health. He began compiling this data, and developing predictive models for their trajectory, over a decade ago. Immediately after their last significant conversation, their eyes fixed on the display, a mixture of bewilderment and dawning horror on their faces. The data was damning, far more detailed and accurate than anything their own team had ever presented. It highlighted every bad investment, every over-leveraged asset, every hidden liability, and, most crushingly, it showed the precise moment their empire began its irreversible decline, the exact turning point they had missed. And then, he pulled up another layer of data, a new set of glowing lines and figures. And this, he continued, his voice steady, was a detailed breakdown of the legal weaknesses of the acquisition that led to their current lawsuit. He identified these vulnerabilities in his analysis as early as 10 years ago. It was a ticking time bomb. They simply chose to ignore the ticking, believing themselves immune. Elara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. He knew. He observed, he corrected, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, yet resonating with immense power, and he analyzed. While they were focused on maintaining appearances, he was focused on understanding the true mechanics of power and vulnerability. He saw the cracks they were too proud, or too complacent, to acknowledge, too afraid to truly examine. Then came the grand reveal, the moment the full scope of their predicament, and his true, unassailable power, became undeniably clear, shattering their remaining illusions. They were correct, he said, his voice gaining a quiet intensity that filled the room. They needed a bailout. They needed a legal strategy. And they needed a complete restructuring of their entire operation. He leaned forward, his gaze sweeping over each of them, locking eyes with them one by one. And he was indeed the only one who could provide it. Not because he was benevolent, or because he felt any familial obligation, for that had been severed long ago. But because, through his various holding companies and investment funds, he was already, as of this very morning, their largest creditor, holding the fate of their empire in his hands. Silence, absolute and deafening, descended upon the room. Their faces, already pale with dread, drained of all remaining color. Serafina's jaw dropped, her perfectly sculpted features collapsing into a mask of pure disbelief, a raw, unfiltered shock. Elara stared at him, her eyes wide, haunted, as if seeing a ghost rise from the past, a ghost of her own making. Impossible, the chief financial officer stammered, his voice weak, barely audible. They would have known. Their due diligence. Their due diligence, he interjected, a cold edge to his voice, cutting him off, was as outdated as their business model. His acquisitions were made through a complex web of shell companies, through strategic investments in their debtors, and through quietly buying up their distressed bonds on the secondary market over many years, patiently accumulating leverage. Each transaction was perfectly legal, perfectly untraceable back to him, until now. He simply waited for the moment when his accumulated leverage would be undeniable, when they would have no recourse. They saw a collection of disparate, anonymous entities. He saw the building blocks of their eventual dependence, their inevitable fall. He then presented them with a series of sleek, bound documents, pushing them across the table, their stark white pages a stark contrast to the dark wood. These, he said, indicating the papers with a gesture, were the agreements. They stipulated that in exchange for his intervention, which would involve a full financial restructuring, a complete overhaul of their leadership, and the immediate sale of their most prestigious, yet financially draining, assets, he would take a controlling stake in the Montague Group. A majority share. effective immediately. And yes, that included the family mansion, the private jet, and all the properties they held so dear, the symbols of their power. The air in the room became thick with their unspoken outrage, their impotent disbelief. They had come to beg for a lifeline, not to relinquish absolute control. They had come for a handout, not to be absorbed, to be devoured by the very man they had cast aside. This was blackmail. Serafina finally hissed, her voice trembling with impotent rage, the words barely escaping her throat. No, Serafina, he corrected, his voice calm, unyielding, a rock against her fury. This was a rescue. On his terms. Terms that reflected the true value of his assistance, and the true cost of their past actions. They disowned him, he remembered. They told him to make his own bed. Well, he had. And now, they found themselves in desperate need of a place to rest their heads, a place he happened to own, outright. He looked at Alara, her face a crumpled mess of shock and dawning realization, the full horror of her mistake finally settling upon her. She had asked him, years ago, not to contact them again unless he had something substantial to offer the family. He believed he had now presented that offer. It was substantial, indeed. The immediate aftermath of his revelation was, as expected, a chaotic storm of disbelief and impotent rage. Serafina erupted first, her carefully constructed composure shattering into 1,000 pieces, like delicate porcelain. She screamed, not coherent words, but raw, guttural sounds of fury and betrayal, her voice hoarse with emotion. He was a snake. An absolute snake. How could he do this to them? To his own family. Her accusations, once so potent and cutting, now sounded hollow, pathetic, devoid of any real power. Alara, on the other hand, reacted with a chilling, almost theatrical silence. Her face was ashen, drained of all color, her eyes fixed on him, not with anger, but with a horrifying realization that transcended mere emotion. The immense weight of her past actions, her casual dismissal, her profound cruelty, was crashing down on her, a tsunami of regret. She saw not the disowned son, but the architect of her own downfall, rising from the very ashes of her contempt, a phoenix born of her disdain. The chief financial officer and the legal counsel looked utterly stunned, their faces pale, their professional facades crumbling into dust. They had been blind as their employers, to the quiet, relentless machinations that had been unfolding for years, right under their noses. This was preposterous, the legal counsel finally managed, his voice shaky, barely a whisper. These agreements, they couldn't stand. They would fight this. They would tie him up in court for years. He merely smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a chilling promise. They were welcome to try, he replied, his voice calm, unyielding, betraying no hint of concern. But as he had already demonstrated, he understood their legal vulnerabilities better than their own team did, having studied them for a decade. Every step he had taken, every acquisition, every bond purchase, had been meticulously vetted by the best legal minds money could buy, legal minds far superior to their own. It was airtight, legally unassailable. They would be throwing good money after bad, exacerbating their already crushing losses, and simply delaying the inevitable. And he assured them, he had far more resources and far more patience than they could ever dream of possessing. He then explained, in chilling detail, how his controlling stake would immediately dissolve their positions on the board, how their names would be stripped from the company's official documents, and how their public image, once their most treasured asset and the very foundation of their power, would be irrevocably tarnished by the subsequent financial investigations and the devastating revelations that would inevitably follow. The Montague name, once a revered symbol of prestige, stability, and old-world power, would become synonymous with ineptitude, corporate mismanagement, and a shocking lack of foresight. The fallout was swift and devastating, a cataclysm that swept through their world. His offer, brutal as it was their only path to avoiding complete public annihilation and personal bankruptcy, a total erasure from the world they knew. After a frantic, hours-long consultation with their external legal team, and faced with the stark, unyielding reality of their situation, they had no choice but to sign. The pen Elara used trembled so violently she could barely form her signature, each stroke a testament to her shattered will. Serafina signed with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred in her eyes, a silent promise of future vengeance, but sign she did, for her survival depended on it. The media storm that followed was precisely what he had anticipated, a maelstrom of headlines and breaking news. The headlines screamed about the dramatic fall of the Montague empire, the shocking revelations of its financial mismanagement, and the equally shocking, almost mythical, rise of the mysterious tech titan, Rhysand, who had swooped in to pick up the pieces, an unexpected savior. The story of his past, of being disowned by his own family, quickly became public knowledge, a narrative that captivated the masses. The public narrative shifted dramatically from their perceived victimhood to their profound hypocrisy, their casual cruelty laid bare. The very public who had once scorned him, dismissing him as a failed dreamer, now celebrated his resilience and his quiet, strategic genius, turning him into a reluctant hero. Their reputation, the very thing they had valued above all else, was not just stained, it was utterly destroyed, irrevocably shattered. Elara and Serafina, once unshakable fixtures of the social scene, their every move documented and emulated, became recluses, retreating into the shadows. The grand mansion, the very symbol of their status and power, was sold as part of the restructuring, its opulent rooms now filled with strangers. Their once lavish lives, filled with designer clothes, exotic travel, and extravagant parties, were reduced to a quiet, almost austere existence. They lived in a modest apartment now, a stark, painful contrast to their former opulence, a constant reminder of their fall. Their social circles, once so vast and eager to bask in their reflected glory, evaporated overnight. Those who had once flocked to them for connections and favors now shunned them, fearing the contagion of their failure, the stain of association. The betrayal they had inflicted upon him, the emotional abandonment, was now reflected back at them, multiplied by the unforgiving lens of public opinion. Their pleas for help, once a desperate whisper, were now a constant, silent lament, echoing in the quiet confines of their new lives. They looked at him now, when their paths occasionally crossed at public events or industry conferences, not with anger, for that was a luxury they could no longer afford, but with a profound, almost heartbreaking regret. The kind of regret that only comes from realizing the true cost of their superficiality, a realization that had taken a decade and the complete collapse of their entire world to achieve. Years had passed since that day, since the signing of those fateful documents. His empire, Ether Labs and Quantum Nexus, continued to thrive, expanding into new frontiers, pioneering technologies that genuinely improved lives, creating real, tangible value. He was no longer the disowned son, he was Rhysand, the visionary, the architect of a future he had built entirely on his own terms, without a single concession to his past. His reclusive nature remained, a preference for quiet innovation and strategic foresight over public fanfare and shallow applause. But the peace he felt was profound, deeply rooted not in material wealth or the downfall of his family, but in the knowledge that he had built something true, something resilient, forged in the crucible of betrayal and rejection. He had not sought their ruin out of petty spite or childish rage. Their downfall was a direct consequence of their own choices, their own inherent flaws, their own refusal to adapt. His role was simply to observe, to understand, and to be ready when the inevitable happened, to be the steady hand that caught the pieces. The true, sweetest revenge was not their loss, but his absolute independence, his unshakable confidence, and the undeniable proof that true value lies not in inherited titles or superficial prestige, but in one's own intellect, resilience, and unwavering commitment to their vision. It was a profound lesson in life. When faced with adversity and betrayal, one's greatest power lies not in seeking immediate retribution, but in cultivating one's own strength, in building one's own kingdom, and in allowing one's success to be the quiet, undeniable testimony to one's worth. For in the end, true revenge was living a life so extraordinary, so fulfilling, that those who once sought to diminish him were left to witness the splendor of his rise, while they were left with nothing but the dust of their own bitter choices. If stories like this resonate with you, Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into human resilience and ambition. And tell us in the comments below, what do you think was Rhysand's most powerful secret weapon? Was it his intellect, his resilience, or his patience? Share your thoughts.